Today I'm going to show you how to work in the Basics panel in Camera Raw and how to read a histogram. So we're going to, as always, start off in Adobe Bridge. From there we'll go to Camera Raw, and from there, if we need to, we could go to Photoshop. We won't do that today. Um, Bridge helps me organize my pictures and evaluate them. Like here, I can easily see the one that I shot normally is probably the best exposure. I have all the metadata here for that particular exposure. The underexposed image is 2 stops underexposed, and the overexposed one is 2 stops overexposed, with each one in between in 1/3 increments. The reason I did that was not because I don't know how to make a proper exposure. I used bracketing in this case because I wanted to open these all up simultaneously in Camera Raw to show you how the histograms differ. So I'm going to highlight all these images and open them all up at once in Photoshop, rather Camera Raw. And you can see on either the left, or you can set it up to appear on the bottom, all of your thumbnails. We have my overexposed image, my underexposed image, and my properly exposed image, and all the others in between. So how do I know this is properly exposed? Well, I come here, first of all, it looks pretty good. It's not too light, it's not too dark, but I can be more analytical about that by looking at my histogram, which is a graphic representation of the image. And it's even broken it down into colors. We can see there's a lot of reds and yellows in this picture, and not much in the way of blues and greens. I can work with that later. But first I want to talk about the exposure. See how the information is nice and evenly distributed. It's not leaning to the right, it's not leaning to the left. Whereas with my underexposed image, everything is leaning towards the left, which means I don't have much detail, especially in my shadows. And here I don't have much detail in my highlights, and you can see the histogram is now leaning towards the right. So it's very important to know how to read a histogram. You might want a histogram leaning towards the right. If you were shooting in snow, you might want a histogram leaning towards the left if you're doing night photography. But in virtually in most other situations, normal is going to be evenly distributed. Okay. Now, if it's not evenly distributed, how can I make it evenly distributed? Well, let's start off with the underexposed one. The most useful slider, these are all called sliders, is going to be the exposure slider. So I move that to the right, and it increases the lightness of the image. And I can even see here in this highlighted area that it's increased it 2 stops. And if I go to the bottom image, I can do the same thing. I can decrease it 2 stops or more. Usually, it's not going to be as good as had I shot it correctly in the first place, but it's going to be very close. Okay, or if not close, adequate. That being said, generally it is better to work with the best exposure. So first thing, when you get into Bridge, take a good look at your files, open up the best exposure, bring it into Camera Raw. Now here, what could I do to improve this picture? Well, it's to yellow. So by moving the temperature slider to the left, I have this wonderful tool where I can go too far and go too blue, but probably about 3400 degrees Kelvin, which is a temperature of light, is going to look really good here. And see, what have I done? Fit in view. There we go. So that's a great tool for correcting your color. That is probably your most effective tool for correcting color. The tint tool is a little bit different. You're going to use this a lot less. It can be very nice for giving a kind of cool or warm feeling to a picture, or to change the overall palette. If you don't like it, just double click on it. I very rarely ever use that. Now and then it comes in handy. As I move downwards, I have a number of sliders. Again, the exposure, maybe I can get really subtle with this. Maybe get a 5% down, and I can use this to increase or decrease my contrast. Usually I play with my whites and blacks first. So I have here a white highlight clipping warning and a black or shadow clipping warning. That will tell me, as I go to the whites, for example, when I start to see red, all those areas that are red that aren't part of the picture are going to be completely white. So I want to be very careful with that. I don't think I need to use that slider for this image. The shadow clipping warning, maybe I'll bring it down just a little. You can just see a little bit of black in my image. Take a look at the highlights in your image right here. I knew even when I took this picture that this was going to be a bit of a problem. And I would want to maybe bring a little detail in this highlight of the left side of the top of the tetherball. So I'm going to bring that down a little bit. Lovely. And I'm going to maybe bring my shadows down a little bit too, just to give a little bit more sense of depth to the image. And now I'm getting pretty close. So instead of using just one slider, I use these 4 sliders to work with my contrast. Texture, take a look at the skin of the tetherball. If I move the texture slider to the right, it's going to make that pop a little bit. But it's all kind of making the brocade pop too, and since I wanted that to be out of focus, I really preferred not to use that slider for this image. Clarity, an excellent slider for black and white when you have a lot of similar values that you want to separate in an image. Here, I don't think I need it. Basically, it increases the contrast just in the midtones rather than the whole image. And haze is a useful slider if you want to remove or increase the haze in a landscape. Generally, photographers don't like haze because particularly photographers who believe everything should be always sharp. I find more along the lines of Chinese landscape painting or Renaissance landscape painting that haze actually increases the sense of depth in an image. It's often put there deliberately. And so I don't mess with the dehaze slider very much, but it's there if you want it. This image has no haze, so there's no reason to use it. Vibrance increases the saturation or decreases the saturation of everything except the flesh tones. And we don't have any flesh tones here, so no need to use that. The saturation slider is for when you want to increase or decrease the saturation of everything in the image. If you only want to increase or decrease one kind of color, one color at a time, you can do that using the color mixer, which I'll show you another time. I think this picture is a little bit oversaturated to begin with, so I'm going to bring it down just slightly. And now if I hit the P key, we can see what we started off with and where we're at now. Just using one panel in Adobe Camera Raw. One last thing I'd like to show you for this panel is the ability to make your image black and white. Notice how my histogram really popped up here when I hit that button. Whoa, okay. So again, I actually kind of like this image black and white. It's a lot more abstract and dynamic, I think, and less distracting. So maybe I'll leave it as a black and white image for now. Be careful of this little auto button. Auto is really for people who don't understand everything else going on here. It's really to be avoided most of the time. So when you're ready to move on to Photoshop, you click the open button. If you don't want to save any of the changes you've made, you click cancel. But if you want to save the changes without permanently saving them, click done. And what happens, as you can see, is all the images we worked on will be saved with a sidecar file called an XMP file. And it's important that you don't throw that file away, but if you ever archive these images, you include the XMP file in the archive, because otherwise you will lose all the changes you made. And but nothing is really permanent here. We're working non-destructively, which is to say that I can always go back to my original raw file if I want to. In fact, all I really need to do that is to throw away my XMP file. And so that's probably enough information for one day. And think about what I've covered and let me know if you have any questions. Have a good day.